Good evening,
Good evening.
and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit, with Robin Bernstein in conversation with Kevin Quashie. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page following the live stream. I'm pleased to say also that C-SPAN is here recording the program, and I've been asked to say that if you are interested in asking a question after the program, please wait not just for our mic, but also for C-SPAN's boom mic to come so that your question will be answered or recorded as well. My name is Scott Casper. I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society. Tonight, we are honored to help launch a brand new book. In fact, a book that will be officially released on May 1st by an author who has been part of our American Antiquarian Society community for many years. Robin Bernstein is the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies and of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. She's the author of Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, which won 5 awards, including Best Book prizes from the New England American Studies Association, the Association for Theater in Higher Education, and the International Research Society in Children's Literature. For her first book, Robin held a J. and Deborah Last Fellowship here at AAS in 2008-2009. I will also add that Professor Bernstein has been a crucial advisor to AAS's current NEH grant, Historic Children's Voices. After Robin Bernstein talks for a bit, she'll be joined in conversation by Kevin Quashie, who is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in English at Brown University. He's the author or editor of 4 books, most recently, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, and Black Aliveness, or a Poetics of Being. Black Aliveness has been awarded 2 prizes, the James Russell Lowell Prize from the Modern Language Association and the Pegasus Award for Poetry Criticism from the Poetry Foundation. So we are honored and pleased to welcome both Robin Bernstein and Kevin Quashie here with us this evening, and I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Robin Bernstein. Welcome.
Thank you all so much. I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you all for coming out tonight on this beautiful day. Thank you. Thank you, Scott Casper, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Nan Wolverton and Stephanie Corrigan for making this event possible. I thank Tide Pool Bookshop for supplying books for tonight's event. And I also want to thank C-SPAN for sharing this conversation with their viewers on American History TV. I thank the American Antiquarian Society writ large, which has been one of my most important intellectual homes since I had that fellowship here in 2008 to 2009. And that I was here for only 1 month, and the month was completely transformative. It simply transformed my first book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights. The expertise and generosity of the staff, the astounding resources, and the camaraderie of the other fellows all enabled me to write a book that I could not have imagined otherwise. So many thanks. I also thank Professor Kevin Quashie, who has generously joined me in conversation tonight. Kevin has shaped my thinking since 2012, when he published his luminous book, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture. In 2018, I came to Brown to share early work from what would become Freeman's Challenge. Kevin responded with thoughts and questions that pushed me to think in new ways about William Freeman and his family. Being in conversation with Kevin tonight feels like a gift and a homecoming. Thank you, Kevin Quashie. I began writing Freeman's Challenge because of 2 moments of surprise. The first surprise happened when, by chance, I found a footnote about a theatrical staging of a black on white murder. And this was in 1846 in the city of Auburn, which is in central New York State in the Finger Lakes region. I was astounded. And here's why. My fields of expertise include American racial formation and theater and performance history. So what I knew from both of these fields was that in the mid-19th century, white people absolutely did not want to see any representations of black on white violence on stage. It was too terrifying, it was too disturbing, it could not be contained within the framework of entertainment. And so for that reason, it simply wasn't present on the American stage. And I'll give you an example to show you how not present it was. When people performed Othello, Othello, of course, contains a scene of black on white violence. And people would bend over backwards, turn themselves into pretzels to avoid showing that. And one of the things that they would do, white performers would perform the role of Othello as an orientalized character, as swarthy and as distinctly not American and certainly not African American. So this is how much white people did not want to see these images on stage. So when I found this footnote, I knew that something very strange had happened to make white people behave in a way that was so different from other white people at the same time. So what I asked was, what happened in Auburn in 1846 to cause such unusual, such unexpected behavior? So I started researching the crime that was the subject of the theatrical performance, and I started with the man who was at the center of it, whose name was William Freeman. This is William Freeman. I quickly learned that William Freeman was an Afro-Native teenager who was convicted in 1840 of a horse theft that he swore he didn't commit. Despite a lack of evidence, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in the Auburn State Prison. The Auburn State Prison was distinctive because it enclosed factories where prisoners were leased to private companies, usually for 30 cents a day. The prison pocketed all of this money. The prisoners received no cut. William Freeman was forced to manufacture animal harnesses, to dye silk, and to make carpets. These goods were sold throughout New York State to consumers. And this was my second surprise. I thought, convict leasing? In New York? In the 1840s? In factories? Like many people, I associated convict leasing with the post-Civil War South and also with agricultural labor. I was familiar with important works like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and Douglas Blackmun's Slavery by Another Name. And these books, along with Ava DuVernay's film 13th, suggest that profit-driven carceral practices began with the Civil War, after the Civil War, with the end of Southern slavery and the passing of the 13th Amendment, which famously states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except as a punishment for crime. But in fact, convict leasing existed in the North decades before the Civil War. It developed in the context of Northern, not Southern slavery, the end of Northern, not Southern slavery. And the Auburn State Prison, where William Freeman was incarcerated, developed this practice. So this project began with 2 surprises. And when I took these 2 surprises in, a question emerged, which was, did these surprises have any relationship to each other? Did the practice of convict labor in the Auburn State Prison somehow lead to white people behaving in Auburn in such an unusual way? To figure out the answer to this question, I wrote Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. So who was William Freeman? William Freeman grew up in Auburn in the black neighborhood of New Guinea. He was born in 1824 into Auburn's most prominent black family. His enslaved grandparents were revered as the founders of New Guinea. William Freeman grew up in a close-knit, lively social world organized around private gatherings, church, anti-slavery action, home-based education, and work. But alongside William Freeman, near New Guinea, something else was growing, and that was the Auburn State Prison. The Auburn State Prison was internationally famous because it innovated a novel form of incarceration. Unlike other prisons at the time, the Auburn prison was not established primarily to punish or to confine or to redeem people. Rather, it was built by white businessmen for the explicit purpose of stimulating economic development. The building of this prison in 1816 caused $20,000 in state funding immediately to flow into Auburn. And at the time, Auburn was a tiny little village with fewer than 2,000 people. And $20,000 is the equivalent of $500,000 in today's money. So you can imagine if you have a tiny little village with 2,000 people and all of a sudden you have what is now $500,000 flowing in, it is going to transform everything. And that is exactly what happened. The builders' goal, this was the plan from the beginning. The builders' goal had nothing to do with justice or reform. Their goal was to transform Auburn from a village into a city. And that is what happened. The business was, the prison that was a business was built on the banks of the Owasco Outlet. So you can see right here, this river, this is the Owasco Outlet. And it was built on the banks of the Owasco Outlet for the explicit purpose of powering factories. So even before the prison was built, it was imagined to enclose factories for the purpose of manufacturing goods. The deed, this land here was sold to the state for $1, and the deed actually states that a dam will be built, and you can see the dam right there. A dam would be built in order to power these factories inside the prison and also to power the private businesses of the men who sold this land for $1. So the people who created this prison viewed the prison as a vehicle by which to soak up state funds, manufacture goods, stimulate commerce, build banking, and develop land and waterways. In short, they reimagined the prison as an infrastructure for capitalism. This economic plan was supported by what became known as the Auburn system of incarceration. So the Auburn system of incarceration has a number of characteristics. One is that the Auburn system, the prison ran through a system of extreme social isolation. The men who were imprisoned in Auburn were put into solitary confinement every single night. And during the day, they worked in factories. They worked together in these factories, but they were not allowed to speak to each other at all, ever. And they were not even allowed to look at each other's faces at all, ever. So this was an extreme social isolation. People could go in Auburn literally for years without speaking a word and without looking at another human face. Of course, people did find ways to communicate. Of course, people did find ways to look at each other's faces, but that was extremely risky because another characteristic of Auburn, another characteristic of the Auburn system was extreme physical violence. So this, and the violence was necessary to enforce the extreme social isolation because this is inhumane, this is unhuman. So there was solitary confinement every night, total silence at every time, at all times, and work in factories. And what's really important to understand is that the purpose of the social isolation, the purpose of the silence, was productivity. The goal was to increase productivity, and the concept behind the isolation was not punishment. The concept was how to control people and get them to work as much as possible, and that was the concept behind the extreme violence as well. So the Auburn system is widely known to scholars of U.S. prison history, and one of the key ideas that I hope comes through in my book is to foreground what this system was for, that it was a system that relied on torture, it was a system that relied on inhumane practices, all for the purpose of manufacturing, all for the purpose of making money. and it absolutely worked. So here is what the prison looked like from the outside, and you can see it looks like a giant factory because that's basically what it was. And I want to point out just a couple of aspects of this. First of all, everywhere you see a smokestack, that's marking the location of a factory. So you can count the smokestacks and you know exactly how many factories there were in the prison. And these were all factories that were run by private companies leasing prisoners. The other thing I want to point out about this image is the locomotive in the bottom left-hand corner. So the train tracks actually grew in relation to the prison. They were bringing raw material to the prison. They were taking goods away from the prison. They were also bringing tourists to and from the prison. The prison was actually making additional money through tourism, believe it or not, and that's something I can talk about more later. And the last thing I want to point out about that train, besides the way it marks the infrastructure of capitalism, is that locomotives were actually built inside the prison. Locomotives were one of the saleable commodities that were actually built by prisoners in the Auburn State Prison. So I'd like to share a slice of Freeman's daily experience in the prison. One of the things that's important to know is that the extreme social isolation was designed to reduce workers, men, to machines. And that was actually the language that was used, that the prisoners should be like machines. And it was all designed to dehumanize and to maximize productivity. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of the daily routine that made that happen. Every morning, Freeman and the other men marched into the prison yard. They emptied their night tubs, which were to use as a bathroom, into the underground tank, rinsed them with pump water, and set them aside. Then they rejoined the lockstep. This is the lockstep. It's a form of marching very closely, and it's designed to prevent men from talking to each other or from seeing each other's faces. They rejoined the lockstep and marched through factories that produced carpets, clothes, barrels, furniture, and more, with each chamber generating a different racket, a different shade of smoke as raw material began to smolder or boil. As men peeled off to assume their workstations, the line dwindled. The last stop was Freeman's, the Haim shop. There, amidst gusts of dust, 72 men made animal harnesses and hardware for carriages. In 1841, which was William Freeman's first year there, Freeman and others built almost 7,000 animal harnesses, plus hundreds of saddles, stirrups, and related items. Their work was sold wholesale at a total market value of almost $32,000. The contractor bought the year's labor from the prison for a fifth that amount, just over $7,000, less than 35 cents per man per day. Freeman's job was to file rough iron that had been imported from England, smoothing it in preparation for a lacquered finish called japanning. Alongside 9 other filers, he burnished the surfaces of buckles, rings, and other hardware for saddles. Freeman filed every morning for 2 hours, then marched to the mess hall for a half-hour breakfast, marched back, filed more, marched, ate dinner, marched, filed. Every movement regimented, every day the same. Another prisoner described this life, quote, "Each morning when I seated myself in the shop and cast a look around me upon things too familiar with my sight, my impression has been accompanied with a sigh. Ah, I am here yet." Freeman resisted his forced labor from the start, and he resisted in a lot of different ways. He resisted by working as little as possible. He resisted by reducing his productivity, and he resisted by clowning around, which came with enormous physical risks. He made other people laugh, and this was a very risky but very humanizing thing to do. And he also resisted by telling the guards point blank that he did not want to work. He felt that it was unfair that he was being forced to work, as he put it, for nothing. He demanded wages. His claim was simple, but it challenged Auburn's defining idea. He insisted that he was not a machine, not a slave, but instead a citizen with rights, a worker. Upon his release from prison, he pursued his claim through legal means. He appealed to magistrates who mocked and dismissed him. And then William Freeman turned to violence. William Freeman committed a quadruple murder that terrified and bewildered white Auburnites. A high-profile trial ensued, and the trial got very big, very fast, and it made national headlines. And one of the reasons that it got so big so fast was that William Henry Seward, who was then best known as the governor of a recent governor of New York, defended Freeman pro bono. And of course, we know that 20 years later, after this, William Henry Seward would become the Secretary of State to Abraham Lincoln, and he would broker the sale of Alaska. If you've ever heard of Seward's Folly, that's him. That was in the future, however. The prosecutor was John Van Buren, who was the son of the recent president, Martin Van Buren. So this was a clash of the titans, and it got very big, very fast. There were daily transcripts of the trial, went out daily on Telegraph, and they got published far and wide. The trial attracted the commentary of Walt Whitman, James McCune Smith, Horace Greeley. A lot of very well-known people commented on it. Now, Freeman was entirely clear about why he killed. He wanted back pay, and if he couldn't have it, he would have payback. But no one, the prosecution or the defense, wanted to hear Freeman's challenge to the Auburn system, because the Auburn system was the engine behind Auburn's prosperity. And by this point, the Auburn system, the Auburn State Prison, was actually a major engine behind New York's prosperity. It was also a major player in party politics. So the prison was very important to a lot of different people, and nobody wanted to hear that it was wrong to make people work for no pay. So nobody wanted to hear it. White Auburnites particularly did not want to hear it. So what they did to not hear this very clear critique that they could not hear, what they did instead was they invented their own story. They invented their own stories in order to drown out what Freeman was actually saying. They could not hear in their effort to silence Freeman's critique of profit-driven incarceration, white people developed two stories, which were both racist libels that were then relatively novel. The first libel that they developed in order to drown out Freeman's challenge to the prison was what would later be called the Black, quote-unquote, social pathology model. And this became a century and a half, a century and 12 decades later, became really important to the Moynihan Report. So Seward argued that Freeman killed because of what would then become called social pathology. The other libel was created by the prosecution, and that was the libel of, quote unquote, innate Black criminality. And that was the story that was told in the theatrical performance that was in that footnote that I found that surprised me so much. White people in Auburn wanted so urgently to deny Freeman's challenge to the prison that they would actually rather see Black on white violence than hear that challenge. They were using the disturbing image of Black on white violence as a distraction from something that they found even more disturbing, even more threatening, which was what William Freeman was saying about the prison in their midst. These paired libels were amplified and disseminated in stories about Freeman, theater, literature, visual images, and above all, the press. And then, of course, Black people had to figure out ways to live with these emerging racist ideas. They forged many strategies, including what Kevin Quashie calls quiet, and I hope this is something that we can talk about in a few minutes. William Freeman's story is not over. Today, we all live with the racist ideas that incubated in his trial, and the Auburn State Prison itself still exists. It is now known as the Auburn Correctional Facility. It is the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States. And manufacturing continues to define it. Today, all New York State license plates are manufactured in the Auburn Correctional Facility. So the people who manufacture New York State license plates, they are literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. So Freeman's story is not over, but a portion of it actually might end literally in the next 5 weeks. There is a bill that is up to for the New York State Legislature, and it's coming up in May. And there's 2 bills that are coming up. One is called the No Slavery in New York Act, and I realize that using slavery to refer to forced carceral labor is a controversial thing, and that's something that we can talk about, but that is what this bill is called. And what this bill does is it basically says that no one will be forced to work in a prison in New York State or in any carceral institution in New York State. It does not take away labor. It does not take away the opportunity to work for people who want to. What it does simply is it takes away the possibility of being forced to work, which is exactly what William Freeman objected to. Then there's a second bill, which is called the Fairness and Opportunity Act for Fairness and Opportunity for Incarcerated Workers. And this bill addresses the second part of Freeman's critique. Freeman wanted not only to be not forced to work, he wanted an opportunity to build a life for himself. So when he wanted wages, he wanted not only wages, but everything that wages confer. He wanted economic stability, dignity, justice. He wanted self-definition as a free man, his name itself. So this second bill addresses that part of Freeman's challenge, that he wanted dignity in his work. He wanted wages that could enable him to build a life. These 2 bills before the New York State Legislature right now, and what they are doing is they are delivering William Freeman's message into the 21st century. It is time to listen and to act. So I ask you to consider going to 13th Forward is a wonderful organization that is leading the charge to pass these 2 bills. Go to 13th Forward, find out how you can support these bills, and together we can finally end forced labor in prisons in New York State. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm great.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
It is an honor to be here with you.
Thank you. I hope everyone's well and safe. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'll say just briefly that this is such a magisterial book. And by that I mean the musician David Crosby was famous for saying that he loved things that were better made than they had to be. And what you've done in this book is taken a really complicated story in the way that perhaps every story about race in America is complicated because of our compounded incapacities of facing the thing. And you've just found a narrative way of trying to witness what is difficult. So what an incredible book. And I'm so glad that it's here. I'm so glad that people will get to experience it. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's a gift to all of us. So you said as you were speaking, you mentioned the kind of isolation and one could even think of the kind of metaphor of silences that reverberate across the story, not just in the prison, in terms of Freeman's what he's able to say about what he did, what people are able to hear and not willing to hear, and maybe not willing to understand. Could we talk a little bit more about how you, as you're doing the research for this book, how were you thinking about how voice and expressiveness is operating across the story?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for being here. It is such an honor to be in conversation with you.
Please.
I have learned so much from Kevin Quashie, and I'm so grateful to him for being here. Um, there were two prime directives as I was researching. There were two things that I was always trying to do. One was to hear William Freeman's voice. I was always trying to find his voice. He never wrote. He never wrote anything. He never wrote out his story. He also did not testify at any of his trials. So everything that we have from him is filtered through people who heard him speak. And it was a lot of white people, but it was also a lot of black people. A lot of people in his family said what they heard. Now, of course, every single one of those people was biased. Every single one of those people had an agenda, and so there were reasons to not simply on a literal level believe any one story about what Freeman said. But the way I sought to hear him was by listening across the stories. So if many people who were all describing the same set of events, if they all said things that echoed each other and harmonized with each other, it seemed likely that it was true. The first directive was always listen for the voice, and not just of Freeman, but of his family. So Freeman had a really interesting family, and I learned a lot about them, but most of them did not leave written records. So I was always trying to find their perspective, what they had to say about themselves. And a really profound moment in the research, I was thinking, if only they had written. And then I thought, well, they did write. They had to have written in various ways. I just need to find the writing. I just need to find it in the right way. And one day I realized that the name that the family chose for themselves, the surname, because when William Freeman's grandparents became free, they could have named themselves anything. They could have named themselves after their former enslaver. Lots of people did that, but they didn't. They chose to name themselves Freeman. And I realized that's their autobiography. It's an autobiography in one word, Freeman. That's what they wrote. And that's the most important thing that I can hear. So that was one prime directive. But then the other prime directive was to try to infer as little as possible. I don't have access to William Freeman's interiority. I don't have access to his psychology. And I never wanted to overestimate my access to who he was on the deepest level. So my second prime directive was always to focus on what he did, what he experienced, what I know he experienced. So at every moment when I was writing this, I was asking myself, at this moment in the story, what did Freeman see? At this moment in the story, what could Freeman hear or not hear? Because he was at one point beaten so badly while he was in prison that he actually became deafened. So what could he hear? What could he not hear? What could he see? What could he smell? What could he touch? And what did he say? So these were all the ways that I was trying to deal with silence. I was trying to find what I could find and go no further, not infer things that I didn't actually have evidence for. I tried to really let some silences just be silences.
That's actually one of the strengths of the project, I think, because there are those moments where repeatedly Freeman, and tell me if I get this correctly, Freeman says repeatedly two things. As people are asking him questions, why did you do this? Or saying things to him about the trial, he says, I don't know. And there are moments where you write around that I don't know because it's pressured partly by he's deafened, and so it might be that he can't hear everything that people are saying to him. People might not be sensitive to needing to project or to speak or communicate in a way. It might be something else, and I'd love for you to talk about that I don't know. And that is balanced by the fact that he's clear that when he's asked, you know the moment I'm talking about, when he's asked, who made you this way? What made you this way?
Yeah.
And he says,
The state. He's absolutely explicit that his real target is the state. He could not have been clearer about what his critique was, why he did what he did, and people just could not hear. And it was mostly white people, but not only white people, who just did not want to hear his challenge to the system that was making them prosperous. Yeah.
That's such an incredible balance between a person who at once declines or refuses, or, you know, whether it's performative or genuine, who says, I don't know, when being interrogated. Mm-hmm. And when the question is so singular, yeah. That he is unwavering in terms of saying the state.
Yeah, so he sometimes said, I don't know, when what I suspect is that he could not hear.
Yes.
But I don't know that. That's speculation. He also, he was very good at refusing to answer questions he didn't want to answer. So at one point, when he is captured and he is interrogated, at a certain point, he just clams up. He decides, I'm not going to answer any more questions. And he uses silence. And this is after he had been released from the Auburn State Prison. He had been living with 5 years of enforced silence. And then he is arrested for this act of violence, and he is interrogated. And by this point, he knows the power of silence. He knows how powerful it is. And he answers some questions, and then he decides he's done. And he says, I'm not going to answer any more questions. So he was somebody who was absolutely able to use silence and use it in a very strategic way.
And that's such a great response, right? Because part of his saying, the state made me this way, is not only the way in which may be related to the way he uses silence, but the way he manufactured the weapons that he used for the murder. He picked some of that up from being in the prison also. And so they're just these, part of the book is this, like, laying bare to the lie of prisons as a site of rehabilitation.
Oh, yeah.
And the way in which you use his case as an exemplar of that lie. Yeah. It's really terrific. Could we talk about, there's a moment both in your presentation today and in the book, a chapter where you think about people wanting to know, why did you do this? Could you talk a little bit about, you talk about why and how in the book, and maybe even what. Could you say a little bit about that as it relates to the complexity of this case?
Yeah. So Freeman's story has been told in some ways for almost 200 years. He's best remembered, William Henry Seward defended him using the insanity defense. And it was not the first use of the insanity defense in the United States, but it was one of the first. So this was extremely novel. And Freeman's case actually set some precedent for the use of the insanity defense in New York State. So Freeman's case is when it has been written about, very often it's been written about in the context of the insanity defense. It's been written about in the context of legal history. And the reason that the insanity defense is so important is that it answers the question of why. Why did he kill? It answers that question in a way that was very comforting. If your livelihood is dependent on the prison and the prison has been challenged, it is very comforting to hear that the person who committed this act of violence is simply irrational in every possible way, which is what Seward was arguing. So this story has been brought forward as a why kind of story, what everybody wanted to know in the moment, and this infiltrated into the storytelling over decades was, why did he kill? He told us why. He told us why, and there was no mystery. So one of the things that I did in the book was to say the real mystery is why people kept asking why. The real mystery is why they couldn't hear the answer that was so clear, repeated, very straightforward. Why did they keep asking why? And that, to me, that was the meat of this, of the second half of the book, how people got so psychologically invested in specific explanations for the crime when the real story, the real explanation was right there on the table. So I flipped the switch in the part of the book that you're referring to. We go from, why did he kill, which was the question that everybody has been asking for 170 years, to why do we keep asking this question? And when you asked about the what also, when people could not hear the why that Freeman gave them over and over, so they just, the more they couldn't hear it, the more they had to ask the question again and again. And then they started moving to questions of what. And the way you put it earlier in our conversation earlier was, what was he? Was he, quote unquote, a lunatic? Was he, quote unquote, innately violent? What was he? These were more ways of avoiding hearing what Freeman was actually saying.
Part of what you do too in the project related to this incapacity to hear, it's really like a practice of not hearing.
Yeah.
Which really is part of the book is really a confrontation with our incapacity to witness and to stay with. James Baldwin always talks about we must try to bear it, and part of the American logic might be that we're not very good at trying to bear it. Mm-hmm. You walk us through just his diligence when he gets out of prison in terms of first trying to get recompense, that he goes to magistrates, he goes to try and get a haircut to clean up, he goes to try and get a job as a farmhand. So there's this real, for a person who comes out of prison and is disoriented in all of the ways, went in at, was it 15?
15.
Right? It comes out 5 years later, the town has changed, he's lost most of his hearing, and yet he has this kind of deliberateness about trying to build a life as a citizen. As complicated as that word can be, he's trying to do right by being a citizen, and one of the acts is to say, I want to be paid for my labor. Yeah. And he goes through all of these processes. And so it's amazing in the book to have you juxtapose that diligence against this larger racist narrative of either it's craziness or some manifestation of that really terrible idea that Black people are somehow subhuman, less than human, not human animal. Yeah. So I think there's this, across the project is this insistence on our incapacity to bear the answer, that there is no answer to why. Yeah. The answer is the state. Yeah. He told us it's the state. Yeah. How do we live with that? Yeah. Could we talk then about, could you say something about what were the responses from his family and from the Black community? Because that's another part of the complexity of the story. And again, I'll say in this forum and for anyone listening online, part of what I think is the accomplishment of the book is how you really balance so beautifully a difficult story to tell. Mm-hmm. Not difficult only because of the violence at the heart of it, but difficult because of how complicated the interlocking parts of it are. Say something about his family's response, the Black community's response.
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, I'll go to an essay by Angela Davis. Angela Davis wrote this essay that was very helpful for me in writing this book, where she lamented the fact that Frederick Douglass did not take up the beginnings of convict labor as a major cause. Frederick Douglass did have a little bit to say about prisons, but not that much. And Angela Davis basically wrote this essay wishing that he had taken it up as a major cause when convict labor practices were in their infancy, by which she meant the post-Civil War. And she was referring to the South. But when we understand that actually convict labor began in New York State, which was where Douglass was living, the fact that he never took it up is all the more astonishing if we are thinking from our perspective. So one of the things that I'm doing in this book is really answering this question: why was it not a major rallying cry for amazing people, brilliant geniuses like Frederick Douglass, also Harriet Tubman, who lived in Auburn. Right. She lived in Auburn 2 miles away from the Auburn State Prison for the second half of her life, from the 1850s through her passing in 1913. So why wasn't there more organizing against the prison? And in answer to your question about his family loved him. His family really loved him, and that was really clear. And they, some members of the family testified on his behalf in court, which was an extremely brave thing to do. And some of them suffered enormous white retribution for their testimony. So I want to really honor their courage in testifying on behalf of William Freeman. So some of them did that, and then some of them didn't. Some of the members of his family and his community had difficulty hearing his challenge for some of the same reasons that the white people did, which was that they were also part of an economic system. They were also embedded in Auburn. But the other reason was that, of course, they weren't clairvoyant. So why did Frederick Douglass not rise up against the beginnings of convict labor? One really important answer is that there was no way to know, from the perspective of especially the mid-19th century, what convict labor was going to turn into. There was no way to know that, there was no way to imagine mass racialized incarceration. Black people were disproportionately incarcerated in the Auburn State Prison during Freeman's lifetime, but the actual numbers were very small, were relatively small. And there were people who were upset about it at the time, and there were people who were critiquing that at the time, but there was no way to imagine 150 years into the future with mass racialized incarceration. So that absence of clairvoyance on anybody's part, I'm certainly not clairvoyant, and they weren't either, they were embedded in their own moment, and they were embedded in the same rising capitalism, the same economic structures as everybody else. So his family and his community was very mixed. But I think what I just want to end with is that the women in his family in particular rallied behind him. His mother rallied behind him, and his sister-in-law, who was his closest friend, rallied behind him. His sister-in-law, Deborah Depew, she testified on his behalf in court, and she had a very hard time doing that, but she did it.
I'm so glad you mentioned both his mother and his sister-in-law, because they both expressed this incredible care. They also suffered mightily for it. I'd also say that indeed, when you talk about his family's care for him, there's this moment in the book where you talk about, of course, after he's committed these murders, the white community's almost in a kind of frothy mob state, right? And both wanting to know why he did it, but also wanting to enact extra-legal justice against him. And his family members want to know how he is and how he's being treated. And so there's that even with the complexity you just described, there's that incredible tenderness that I'm grateful to have in the book. And if I can extend to, when you were talking, one of the things you showcase in the book is that people in the Black community were advocating for the things they were advocating for schools and for voting rights. And you said this thing, which I hadn't thought of before, because I'm not a historian of this era, but you say this thing that I think is really worth highlighting, that for Black activists in New York in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, they were imagined the opportunity to be able to defend oneself before a jury would have been a kind of incredible acquisition of citizenship, such that the prison being against the prison wouldn't necessarily seem to be high on their list, because they were actually trying to think about the opportunity to actually be able to defend oneself, which would be the next step in accruing rights. And so these are complicated landscapes.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the question of what was important to Black communities when if they were not rallying against this nascent convict labor, what was important to them, and it's exactly what you just said. They were rallying around voting. They were rallying around the rights of citizenship, including the right to a fair trial. They were rallying around their own economic development. They were rallying against Southern slavery, because of course this was all in the wake of Northern slavery. This was after the end of Northern slavery, very recently after the end of Northern slavery. They were organizing against Southern slavery. So, and they were organizing their communities. They were building churches. They were creating social constructs. They were doing all of these really important things. And when you think about the urgency in the moment of all of these political projects, we can understand better why convict leasing seemed not as important at the time, except it was really important to William Freeman. And he was raising this challenge, and we should understand him in that way as somewhat prescient. You know, he was not imagining the future. He was making this very simple claim, and I think its power was actually in its simplicity. He kept saying that he wanted wages for his work. He never even said, I want the prison to close. He never said this prison system is inherently wrong and it should be abolished. He never said that. He never even said, I want other people to be paid. He just wanted his pay that he deserved for his work. And that is a very narrow claim. And I think a lot of its force actually derived from the fact that it was so narrow and so undeniable. How can you look somebody in the eye and say, no, you don't deserve wages for your 5 years of labor? So the force was actually in the narrowness of the claim.
Beautifully said. Let's, we have a couple minutes. Let's see if there are questions in the audience. People want to ask questions. I could talk all night with you, but and thank you for waiting until the microphones make their way around.
Should I stand? No. Okay, I won't then. Thank you so much for that talk. The book sounds awesome, and I think it's really important that you're not only bringing the story of convict leasing to the North and before the Civil War, but also really the way that Black pathologizing, or the pathologizing of Black criminality was a story that predated not just the 20th century, but also the Civil War. I think it's really important work. I did have a question, a more context-driven question. You kind of alluded to this in your talk, and I'm sure in the book it gets deeper treatment. But Auburn, the penitentiary, was at the center of this kind of national and transatlantic conversation about prison reform. And you kind of were highlighting, I don't know if it was a tension with the profit-driven component of the prison, but one of the things that I was curious about while you were talking about the fact that Auburn was essentially a factory, or at least a series of factories, was its relationship to other penitentiaries in the North as well as the South regarding the economic functions of it. Because was this system, beyond the disciplinary component, was this economic system also being exported to other places? I know that, I've done work on Maryland. I know that they also had profit driven. So would you describe those other prison systems as being convict leasing as well, or how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that. Thank you so much for that. Yes, so the Auburn system was very quickly exported and imitated and duplicated. So it was duplicated almost instantly and exported across the north, across the United States, across the ocean to Europe. So these other prisons that had similar goals, similar economic goals, similar structures, they were all imitating Auburn. So I'll give you just a single example. San Quentin was built on the Auburn model. And this was completely explicit, absolutely deliberate. One of the reasons there were tourists at the Auburn State Prison was because people were so interested in this system and interested in replicating it. There were private tourists who just came to gawk, but there were also many official envoys. So de Tocqueville came to Auburn, and Harriet Martineau came to Auburn. So there were many people who were coming in order to assess the system and make recommendations on whether it should be replicated. So Auburn was, ground zero, but it very quickly spread. And so all of the other systems that we know about that have similar models, they are all in direct relationship, in direct progeny of Auburn.
Okay, we have a question back here on YouTube.
Manisha asks, Robin, thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you could compare this for-profit convict labor Auburn prison with the later development of the convict lease system in the post-war South.
Sure. So Heather Ann Thompson has done really important work on this, on exactly this comparison. So what Thompson argues is that we should understand Southern convict leasing practices post-Civil War as an adjustment on the pre-Civil War Northern practices that originated at Auburn. So for Thompson, the similarities are much more significant than the differences, and there are important differences. Southern post-Civil War convict leasing is not primarily in factory-based manufacturing, for example. So there are really important differences. But Thompson's argument is that the similarities and the continuities are more important than the differences, and I agree with that. And what I would also add is that the lines of influence are explicit and direct. The post-Civil War South was adapting processes that were innovated in the North. And I'll go backwards just a moment to say there are these really wonderful books about convict leasing in the post-Civil War South, and they have produced so much knowledge that is so important, and they have told the story of post-Civil War convict leasing so vividly that it has had these excellent books have had the inadvertent effect of suggesting that that's the whole story. In fact, these wonderful books are starting the story in the middle. And the story they tell is important and correct and true, but it's starting the story in the middle. And by starting the story with the Civil War and the end of the Civil War, what has happened inadvertently is that these excellent books have let the North off the hook. So one of the things that I want to accomplish with Freeman's challenge is to put the North back on the hook. I saw a question over here.
Hold 1 second for the microphone.
Oh, I just wanted to ask or say, aren't there for-profit prisons now?
Oh, yes, absolutely, there are. So, I'm sorry, did you want to say more?
No, but are they run the same way as they had been before?
Yes and no. So different states have different laws. So in New York State, there is still in-prison forced manufacturing. And one thing that I want to state really clearly is that Auburn was never a private prison. Nowadays, when we say prison for profit, often we assume it's a private prison. And so this is one of the arguments that I really want to make, is that when we're talking about a prison for profit, meaning a prison that was built for the purpose of generating profits, that's not necessarily a private prison. So absolutely, there are profit-driven prisons today. It varies state to state how that manifests. In New York State, there is no longer a partnership with private companies. So in New York State, you do not have the same convict leasing that William Freeman experienced, where his work was being leased by private companies. That no longer exists in New York State. Now, today in New York State, there is massive manufacturing. But what incarcerated people build in New York State is materials that are then sold only to the state itself. So things like license plates, for example. So that is a difference, in some ways, but it's still forced labor. And that's why the work of 13th Forward is so important. 13th Forward is working to end forced labor in prisons in New York State. Oh, yes, they do get paid, but they get paid in New York State. By the way, there are plenty of incarcerated people in the United States who get paid nothing, who are forced to labor and get paid nothing. And that is true in many, many states. In New York State, people in prisons are paid for their work, but they are vastly underpaid. So they get paid, for example, the men who make license plates in Auburn today, they get paid 65 cents an hour. So this is not a living wage. And we need to remember that William Freeman wanted wages, but he also wanted fair wages. And that is not what we have in New York State today. And again, this is what the bill about fairness and opportunity, this is exactly what that bill is all about. So 13th Forward, please end convict labor in New York State.
We have to stop soon, but you make a point in the book of talking about that even in the 1840s, there were states that paid prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
New York was not one of them. And indeed, when he left, after 5 years, they gave him $2. This was and you talk about the kind of social pressure that produced that kind of modest compensation to prisoners who were leaving. We should stop soon because we're at about an hour, but
We can try to squeeze in two more quickly,
questions.
I think. So one here from our virtual audience.
And then we have one up front. Okay.
In your talk, you mentioned William Freeman using humor to assert his humanity and resist the state while imprisoned. Can you offer any particular examples of how he used humor in these ways?
Yeah. What he did was, while he was in one of these factories, what he would do is he would make silly faces and cause other prisoners to laugh. Because they did look at each other's faces. They were not permitted to, but of course they did do it. And this was not just him. This was a game that a lot of prisoners played, where they would try to make each other laugh. And it was a very humanizing game, but it was also a really dangerous game. He was caught and he was whipped for it. And he also he was whipped multiple times. One time he danced. Dancing was also forbidden. He was dancing and he was whipped for that. I mean, that's not humorous, but these are examples of ways that he claimed his humanity and resisted the dehumanization of the prison. And these were dangerous and courageous acts.
It reminds us that he was this, by everyone's description, playful and vibrant 15-year-old, got in trouble in ways that young people do, went into prison. And I know you've done a lot of work of cautioning us against the idea of innocence and youth, except that in the case of course, Black people, Black boys and girls, young Black people, that they don't get the same kind of innocence. So when he came out and he was 21, 22, changed, and making this case about payment, about recompense. He was a young person.
Yeah.
He was a young person making this kind of astute, as you say, clearly forced argument that I think also adds to the clarity of your insight about how important his claim was.
Yeah. He was really young. He was a teenager while he was in prison, and he, in a lot of ways, he acted like a teenager, including some of his bravery and some of his bravado. I associate with teenagerness.
Yeah.
We try to squeeze in one last question.
was just very curious what Walt Whitman and Horace Greeley had to say, and also, was there anybody in the press who grasped the importance of Freeman saying this was the state?
Yeah, yeah. So Walt Whitman and Horace Greeley were basically interested in it from the perspective of capital punishment. So Walt Whitman commented on it somewhat extensively in multiple columns. He spoke about it as part of his campaign. He was against capital punishment, and he was arguing against that in many cases, including Freeman's case. Whitman is really interesting. He wrote one column in which he really recognized the challenge, and he really backed it up in a lot of ways. And then all of his other columns on William Freeman, he didn't do that at all. He reversed himself. So Whitman is a little painful because he heard it and then he didn't. And why did he hear it in one moment and then slip into not hearing it in another moment? I couldn't say. And you didn't ask about James McCune Smith, but I'll answer for him too. James McCune Smith commented on the case because he was furious at William Henry Seward. James McCune Smith very clearly recognized the racism in William Henry Seward's defense of Freeman, and he was absolutely furious at him for that.
Part of the excellence of this book, I'll say again, is the way in which you navigate the complicated entanglements of what it is to think about race and racial legacy in American culture. And I've said this to you, if one is building a class of trying to study that complexity, and if Morrison's Beloved is in there and Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, all these books that ask any reader to figure out how do you witness and participate and find your place in this story. I think we could say that your book would be there. So I just want to congratulate you and thank you for sharing it with us. What a phenomenal work.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me. I'm very touched that you would say that. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Robin Bernstein, Kevin Quashie. What a conversation. This is what we hope to do with the American Antiquarian Society, to think about the past in all its complexity and its resonances for our own day. And you've done that marvelously. Thank you. Congratulations, Robin, on the new book, which is Freeman's Challenge. Those of you who are here in person can buy advance copies yourself from Worcester's stellar independent bookseller, Tide Pool Books. They are right out in the lobby to sell books if you would like. I also thank all of you who've been watching online, as well as those who are here in person. This program is being recorded for our YouTube channel. It'll be there. You can tell your friends about that to come to AmericanAntiquarian.org. It's also being recorded for C-SPAN, and it'll be on C-SPAN, we hope, in the near future on American History TV. We have a full slate of programs up ahead. Next up, next Thursday, April 25th at 2 o'clock, is a virtual book talk with Lara Langer-Cohen on ideas about the underground in 19th century America. And then the following week, on May 2nd and 3rd, we are hosting a scholarly symposium on historic children's voices, featuring 15 outstanding speakers. That entire symposium will be hybrid. That is, the speakers will be here in Antiquarian Hall speaking. It will also be live streamed and available afterward on our YouTube channel. So please check out our website for those and other upcoming programs. And again, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Have a good evening.